Thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity to address the inquiry today. I'm the chair of Sydney YIMBY, an independent grassroots pro-housing group. We're a member of the Abundant Housing Network of Australia, a national alliance for housing campaigners building a new vision for housing in cities, one that's more sustainable, livable and affordable for everyone. Our other members include Greater Canberra, YIMBY Melbourne and Greater Brisbane. Our organisations together represent tens of thousands of young and vulnerable people who are doing it tough in Australia's obscene housing crisis. The root cause of this crisis is that more people want to live in Sydney than we currently have homes for. Our message is simple. We need to build homes for these people before they leave Sydney forever or find themselves on the streets. The TOD program is a promising first step in this direction. It creates viable zone capacity in desirable areas, and it does so quickly. There is broad agreement from most here that we need to build many more homes. But to be effective, the program has to identify actual places to put them, and that's the primary animus of the opposition to it. Opponents of the TOD say they want more community consultation and place-based strategic planning. But if after 18 months of talking, that would result in a big increase in density for their area, then I guarantee that Friends of Ku-ring-gai Environment and the Haberfield Association would still be incensed with the results. This gets to the main point of these requests: delay. Councils and opponents of housing are experts at it. I'm sure many people hope that the committee inquiry delays the TOD even further. I'll use the Inner West Council to illustrate my points, but I'll emphasise here that's not because they're exceptional, but because they're my local council and I'm the most familiar with their machinations. Since it was formed 8 years ago, Inner West Council finalised precisely 0 large precinct upzonings. In 2015, the state government planned to upzone Marrickville and Dulwich Hill for the metro conversion. In 2018, those plans were scrapped, with councils to carry them out instead. It took until 2022, which is 4 years, for council to publish draft plans, but they were themselves scrapped within 2 weeks after a couple of angry town halls in Marrickville and Dulwich Hill. Now the plan is to accelerate those rezonings and complete them by the end of 2024. But unfortunately, that means it'll be 9 years too late. The metro will be up and running before a single square metre of concrete is poured, and the delay has cost hundreds of thousands of people a home and drives up rents. That's why the TOD is so important. It has convinced 12 of these 13 affected councils to finally start planning for density around train stations. This should have been done years ago, but it would not have happened without this intervention. One of our concerns is that the program doesn't go far enough. The TOD SEP only applies to a 400 metre radius, but a walking catchment is more like 800 metres. We think this should be extended to 800 metres, and we'd encourage those 12 councils to apply that limit. We'd also encourage this committee and the government to support an ongoing program of TODs, with a few extra stations upzoned each year. This is how we ensure the city grows based on good planning principles. Currently, when council planners do place-based rezoning, it's less about good planning principles and more about annoying existing homeowners as little as possible. That's why so much development happens on major roads. Council planners prefer to subject 20 families to traffic noise and fumes which cause asthma than one family, so that one family on a quiet street doesn't have to look across the road at an apartment building. It is no coincidence that councils concentrate new development in their lowest SES suburbs, as these are the ones who complain the least. And it is no coincidence that Willara has an annual housing target of 100 dwellings, while Blacktown must deliver 3,000. Ultimately, you're left with a system where with high-minded aspirations, but which is compromised by the heckler's veto at every point where those might be applied. It creates the conditions where my daughter's public school is losing multiple teachers a year because they can't afford to live in the Inner West, where RPA struggles to attract nursing and pathology staff, and where those with disabilities are locked out of entire suburbs because of their obsolete and inaccessible housing stock. When you're watching that play out for a while, uniform 400-metre circles around train stations in wealthy areas start to look pretty good.
Obviously, the Sydney YIMBY movement is a social movement as much as anything. I'm wondering if you have some examples of where you have been what you would consider successful in changing the tone of debate and potentially the outcomes of development applications or interactions with councils.
Yeah, so one of our earliest successes was when Inner West Council were going to heritage list about a dozen substations, electricity substations, that some of them were covered with graffiti. They were objectively pretty ugly buildings, and it seemed quite unnecessary to us. We wrote a blog about it, got written about in the SMH the following day, and we went to speak about it at council, and that was removed from the list of new heritage items. We also, I think we significantly changed the tone on this on when the TOD was being spoken about and when councils were moving reports and that sort of thing on this. We saw people turning up to meetings at councils all across Sydney speaking in favour of density because I think this is largely because we gave them the structure and the permission to do so. Like prior to this, people knew they could object to things, but it would never have occurred to somebody to turn up and say, yes, we need more housing. Mm-hmm. And very gratifying to see like people I've never heard of in councils that I hadn't thought about or directed people to go to turn up and make those speeches.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just ask all three of you, just getting down to the more granular level about the type of density that we're seeking to build, and I'm thinking about the supply of family-friendly apartments. Can you comment on the need to increase that supply and how you would go about getting the market to build more three-bedroom apartments?
So I'm raising two kids in a three-bedroom apartment with my wife. There are a couple of things that are under discussed. The first is car parking. A lot of councils require 2 parking spots for a three-bedroom apartment, which is going to make it a lot harder to pencil. I have two parking spots under my apartment. I don't actually use either of them. I don't own a car. There's also a trend from councils to generate this zoning which prioritises short, fat buildings, which makes it hard to build the taller, thinner apartment buildings that have dual aspect, which is what you need to get 3-bedders actually working, because if you only have one aspect on an apartment and you've got 3 bedrooms, you have a whole bunch of dead space behind them that you've got to fill. With 2 beds, you can put a bathroom and a laundry and maybe part of the lounge room. With 3, you've got much more space that you've got to fill, so dual aspect ends up being something that is very desirable for those kinds of apartments, which I think gets overlooked when we put in height requirements because we're scared of shadows.
On what scale do we know that families are prepared to actually make that sort of shift where you don't have a backyard but you're relying on the community space to take the kids out and play and all the rest of it, you know?
We commissioned a survey at the beginning of the year and asked different generations what they thought about the idea of raising a family in an apartment, and you can imagine the older generations were more reluctant. But I think when we got to about Gen Z, I think it was something in the order of 60% of people in favour of that. So I think there is a generational shift, and I think it's also just important to recognise that, you know, the 1970s blocks on the North Shore, for instance, had quite a number of 3-bedroom units built into them as well. It's not a product that's not been delivered in Sydney before. It's a product that's being delivered.
It's definitely a cultural thing. I mean, my wife's from Greece, and it's just what happens.
Yeah.
You know, can I ask you, in terms of the TOD, the overall TOD concept and the trajectory we're on now, and you would have heard in the earlier evidence that the property council's of the view that there needs to be a ministerial directive or an amendment to the SEP to say that if there's a conflict, then the preference will be for the SEP to come in, so to avoid the court process, which will unduly delay it, because the SEP would win anyway in the court, was their view. Yeah, in terms of the SEP overriding DCPs, what's your view on that balance?
So this is very clear on the North Shore, where around the Ku-ring-gai stations, 50% of those areas are covered by heritage conservation areas, and we think in that case, like, developments are prevented because they'll be out of scale, mass, bulk, whatever, with the surrounding houses. And in that case, councils should have to show how you can actually achieve the 2.5 and 6-storey buildings in those areas while meeting their DCP. Otherwise, in that case, it should be overridden because it should be interpreted as an effective block on the SEP's intent.
My question is for Justin Simon of Sydney YIMBY. So thank you for what you and your organisation do. Thank you for giving us our best submission. And I was, I agree with 98% of it. Now, I'm very interested in recommendation 4, which you mentioned Auckland.
Yep.
So you're saying that at some point it's either the Auckland Council or Wellington has said that 75% of the great city of Auckland overnight could build 3-storey buildings on, I'm guessing, standard residential blocks.
Yes.
So firstly, when did that happen?
So that happened in a couple of stages. I think the initial one was in 2012, and then in 2016. So in 2012, it applied to some areas of the city. In 2016, it went across the whole city.
Okay, so that's a fair bit of time. So, and have we, I mean, 3-storey blocks seems fairly modest to me, but have we seen community resistance or community acceptance, generally speaking, about this?
Generally, there's been broad acceptance there. Except in the 25% ended up being what they call character areas, which are equivalent to our heritage conservation areas. But this is something that National supported, that Labor supported, even the Greens were on board with it. This was something that the whole of society was seeing as a problem, and they pushed together for it.
Okay, well, now I can remember reading media reports 10 years ago about how Auckland had the most expensive property in this part of the world. But since these reforms, I mean, that was some time ago, what has been the impact on house prices and rents?
So I only have the data on rents. So rents were down by between 20 and 30% relative to where they would have been if this reform was not undertaken.
They've reduced?
Reduced.
Right. Okay, well, that sounds like a big success.
Yeah, it's an amazing success, but the caution would be with Sydney, if we upzoned for 3 stories, we probably wouldn't get those results because much of Sydney is already 3 stories. Auckland as a whole is a lot less dense than Sydney. So our threshold is, we think, at 6 stories or thereabouts.
Right. So, Mr. Simon, also on affordable and social housing, are you getting much feedback from the people that you're engaging with across Sydney and across New South Wales about how they want to see affordable and social housing delivered?
So in general, our perspective is that with 6 stories, it ends up being quite marginal, which I think is reflected in the low percentage. If you want more, then the state government should be looking to actually pay for that, or the federal government. Instead of pushing those costs onto first home buyers who are buying apartments, which are like, that's the bottom rung on the ladder.
Yeah, and the people that you're engaging with who are speaking to councils and saying that they do want more developments, are they speaking strongly in favour of affordable and social housing?
Some of them are. We were at Inner West, I think 2 months ago, speaking about a Haberfield Defence Land site where we had identified that this was being turned into 19 homes with like 800 square metre blocks that we're going to sell for $3 million. We wanted to look at building, for instance, like 3-story apartments with a large percentage of affordable or social housing on there.
Yeah.
But we have quite mixed views within our group.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just ask, we're nearly at the end of time, just looking at the TOD, how do you think that, do you think that we've got the settings right for green space, deep soil, given the increase of supply that we're hoping for, or that we're planning for? Have you looked at that element of how we do it for the livability of the city, and do you have any views on that?
And this was something I noticed when I was in Ku-ring-gai on the weekend. Every street is lined with trees. This would be an ideal place to put more apartments, and it would be much more pleasant to have them there than, say, building much more of them in Western Sydney.
Oh, and so with that, though, the implication is you don't remove any of those trees in order to do that.
The trees are in the street. Like if you got street trees, those are going to be the most valuable ones, rather than ones at the back of the property where you actually there's very little public use of them. These are the ones that cool where people walk, and which are pleasant when people are walking down the street.
We've just heard a lot of evidence in this inquiry about deep soil and trees. It's not, the value is not necessarily being able to see it and enjoy it. It's actually the value that is achieved.
The ecosystems and so forth.
Well, and the cooling effects that it has for those heating areas and those built up areas. I'm just
So
yeah.
if we're looking at the cooling effects, then people living in eastern Sydney are going to experience temperatures 5 to 10 degrees less than western Sydney, where we're cutting down koala habitat every single day to build housing on the fringe. And if you're going to build...
Sorry, no, I was just talking about the TOD areas,
Yeah,
though,
but
specific.
the TOD SEP is an alternative towards our current kind of sprawl mentality that has kind of dominated Sydney for the last 50 years or so, which we think provides better outcomes in terms of cutting down less trees than previously. And we've also encouraged like taller height limits and those sorts of things for many reasons. We spoke about family-friendly units in kind of thinner buildings and that sort of thing. If you just have the FSR and you say remove or relax the height controls, then people can have more deep soil planting with taller buildings with the same FSR achievable, and you can get better outcomes for almost everyone except for people who may have a phobia of buildings over 15 metres or whatever.